Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome New York Times Chief Architecture Critic, Michael Kimmelman.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. Today is about turning challenges into opportunities. That's the heart of resilience. Resilience is about more than green buildings and soft edges to urban waterfronts. Resilient cities are economically and socially resilient too. They're innovation hubs and creative capitals, equitable places so people of different income levels prosper together. As Jane Jacobs said, cities provide opportunities for everybody when they are created by everybody. They've got to have a robust public transit infrastructure and a healthy network of public parks, spaces of other kinds, sidewalks. A resilient city looks towards the future, by which I mean it anticipates and capitalizes on the challenges that go along with climate change. The drought in California raises a kind of existential threat to the West, but it's also an opportunity. A state that embodies dreams of freedom, diversity, and individual fulfillment has to grapple with the challenges of sharing limited resources, which means rethinking sprawling cities like Los Angeles, not to retrofit themselves to become more like New York, but to invent new, forward-looking models for the metropolis of the 21st century, just as LA has been the model for the late 20th century. Asia and Europe eat our lunch when it comes to passenger rail on which our urban prosperity today rides. America can't build bridges and tunnels and new train stations only after old ones collapse. It's too easy to say that with Washington broken, the federal government, at a time of escalating income inequality, has simply abandoned its historic role as a builder of housing for America's poor. It's too easy to say that innovation has to come at the local level or from private enterprise. Not everything can be accomplished by mayors or by public-private partnerships, which work when there's money to be made. I hope we don't just describe problems today, but talk practically about overcoming those problems. Fortunately, we live in a moment when innovators and entrepreneurs, some in this room, are coming up with more great ideas than ever, which inevitably run into the headwinds of legislation and government. We've all attended conferences where ideas are unveiled that promise to solve all of our city's problems. I wrote the other day about the urgency of building new passenger tunnels under the Hudson River. Everybody in Washington and here who knows anything about transit, infrastructure, and the economy of the entire eastern seaboard knows this is a no-brainer, and they've known this for years. So when is something going to happen? Today, I hope. What we don't talk enough about is process, making the challenge of process an opportunity. We end the day with a talk about refugee camps. More people than ever are displaced and dispossessed by war, civil unrest, environmental calamities, and other man-made and natural causes. Many of them end up in camps like Zaatari on the Syrian border, which had revolts every day after it opened. The camp provided people who had lost everything with food, water, shelter, but not hope and opportunity. So Syrians, a mix of farmers, traders, smugglers, businessmen, some gangsters, took matters into their own hands and demonstrated an urbanizing impulse that is, I think, basic and deeply human. They saw in the most profound challenge an opportunity. We were building a camp, they were building a city, an organic, living place, as Kilian Kleinschmidt, who ran the camp and is joining us today, has put it. That's what I mean by resilience. We have an opportunity today, and I join you in hoping that we seize it and have some fun along the way. Thanks very much. And now I'd like to welcome the Secretary of HUD, Julian Castro. So thank you so much, Mr. Secretary, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure to have you here. You've talked about the value of being a member of a community, your phrase, and preserving neighborhoods and therefore preserving cities that are threatened by rising housing costs. I'll give you some numbers I got from you. There are 19 million low-income households, which means about 75 million people in the country, paying more than half their income on housing that is often substandard. We have this huge digital divide that separates rich and poor. Public housing in the country has $26 billion, with a B, dollar backlog in repair costs, and that means about 20,000 lost apartments to disrepair each year, right? And we all say Washington is dysfunctional. And we talk about public-private partnerships, but they're limited. So you have a pretty easy job, clearly. And I want to press you a little bit about what you can practically do. Let's start with an initiative that you just announced for broadband. Tell me about it.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much for having me. There's a lot that we can still do. Just last week, we announced an initiative called Connect Home. Basically, Connect Home is about connecting public housing communities in 27 cities and 1 tribal reservation in the United States in a public-private partnership, connecting these communities to the internet, because we find that 1 out of every 4 American homes today doesn't have an internet connection. And in public housing communities, the vast majority don't have access right now. And even when they don't have access, they're not taking up that access because of an affordability issue. So we partnered with several different internet service providers, as well as nonprofits, to provide digital literacy efforts. For instance, Best Buy and a number of others. The idea being that if we're going to prosper in the United States in the 21st century, in a time when brain power truly is the new currency of success in the 21st century global economy, we need everyone to be connected. We need everyone to have the same shot at being able to get their homework done, because a whole bunch of homework that is assigned now requires folks to go online. We need working age folks who live in public housing to be able to avail themselves of the internet, because 80% of Fortune 500 companies prefer that you file a job application online. That's the idea behind Connect.
And what's the buy-in for the companies that are involved, like Best Buy?
Well, I think this is part of their philanthropic efforts. Mm-hmm. Some of the more skeptical folks have suggested, is it creating a market for them? Mm-hmm. What we're interested in is getting access to folks, and in that sense.
And what's the long-term goal in terms of supplying broadband access through public housing across the country?
Well, the long-term goal is that this is a demonstration project. We want to measure how much take-up there is, mm-hmm. and then figure out a way to measure more than that. How much does it close the homework gap? Is there some educational or academic benefit in the long run? Be able to prove some success, and then hopefully be able to fund broadband access more robustly in the future. Unfortunately, and I think you allude to this in your question, we do live in this time period where we're in a very resource-constrained environment. And I feel like for those of us who have a progressive vision, now more than ever, we need to be able to demonstrate not just how much money is put into the system, but what the outcomes are from that. And so what we want to do as part of Connect Home, hopefully, is be able to demonstrate some of those outcomes.
You know, you actually raised an issue I wanted to passingly mention later, but measuring those outcomes. From colleagues of yours I've spoken to in Washington, one of the things that's frustrating is that each agency seems to have different ways of measuring cost-benefit analyses. And so
sure.
How do you bring those together in order to prove, essentially, that things are genuinely worth it?
You're right. Now, some of that is, of course, HUD measures differently from the Department of Education or Transportation, fundamentally because we're doing different things. Mm-hmm. Let me tell you first very quickly what we've done at HUD. My predecessor, whom you know well, Sean Donovan, mm-hmm. started something called HUDstat, which basically was the beginning of an effort to more rigorously measure outcomes. You know, how many housing units are being constructed out there with home dollars and CDBG dollars. We're expanding that to look at some of the social services aspect. When we invest in job training or education in public housing, how many more folks get their GED because of that? How many folks apply for college in a given year because we funded those efforts? So you see right there in that example that there is some overlap, for instance, with the Department of Education.
Right.
Now, one of the best things that this administration has done, I think, is to try and break across the silos of different departments. We've done that, for instance, with promise zones. And I suspect that looking at how we can commonly measure outcomes is something that will happen. It has not happened robustly yet, but I do think that it ought to.
So the other major initiative you've announced lately is about fair housing. Mm-hmm. I want you to describe it, but then I also want, if you would, to turn to some of the issues which come up here in New York. You know, we have a situation here in a city like San Francisco where you have gentrification pressures.
Sure.
Very great on low-income communities. They create different situations in terms of integrating communities than they would in other parts of the country. Maybe you can first talk about the program in general, but then we can talk a little bit about how it might apply in New York City.
Yeah, so this was a couple of weeks ago. It's been a very busy 2 weeks at HUD. A couple of weeks ago, we released something called a rule on affirmatively furthering fair housing. The idea behind this was that the 1968 Fair Housing Act that was passed just a week after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., mandated that the Secretary of HUD and the department would affirmatively further fair housing. The problem is that that was never really defined in a concrete way, and more than that, there was never any teeth that was put behind it and guidance given to communities on how they could affirmatively further fair housing. That was what the rule is about. So now, with communities that receive CDBG dollars and other funding from HUD, we're requiring them to file an affirmatively furthering fair housing plan, basically. But we're not leaving it at that. We're giving them an unprecedented data set, a tool, so that they can better understand the landscape of opportunity within their community. Where are the libraries? Where are the fair housing, where are the affordable housing opportunities in a given metro area? What are the policies that they ought to be considering to ensure that more folks of modest means have the chance to live in a high opportunity area? We were very, of course, interested to see the work recently of Raj Chetty and Larry Katz and their Harvard researchers that said that when families have the chance to get to higher opportunity areas in a metro area, that especially young people benefit educationally and then eventually in terms of their jobs. So this rule is really meant to spread out the landscape of opportunity in cities, and you know, we're approaching it in a very aspirational way, a collaborative way. We want to work with communities. At the same time, for those places that we see completely flout their responsibility to ensure that there are fair housing opportunities, HUD is not afraid to use its enforcement power.
You want to hold their feet to the fire.
Sure.
Okay, but here we have a situation where, for instance, the de Blasio administration is looking very hard at areas like East New York, a predominantly poor area, to expand affordable housing. And I guess one of the already the discussion about that has brought in speculators who are already raising prices and beginning to drive out some of the very people who have nowhere else to go. So how would this fair housing policy be applied to efforts like that in a city where we need to have more affordable housing quite desperately, and to make sure that neighborhoods like that are not actually somehow penalized for taking on more of the affordable community?
Yeah, it's a great question. Let me give you an example out of Texas from my backyard. So Texas had a settlement a few years ago that essentially turned into a policy for low-income housing tax credits of giving preference points to developers who are developing affordable housing in areas where there is not an aggregation of affordable housing. So that's one way. Another way is through the use of housing choice vouchers. The monitoring.
But have you been cutting back on vouchers? Is that true?
You mean, has Congress been cutting back?
Has Congress been cutting back?
I haven't been.
Forgive me, yes, I did.
I wouldn't. Congress has not been cutting back on vouchers. They have not been funding as much as we believe are necessary, but Congress has been cutting back significantly over the years on public housing, traditional public housing, and more of it has been going to the voucher side. So on the one end, you have how are you using your housing choice vouchers to help ensure that families can get to higher opportunity areas. On the other, it's physically, what are you doing to build affordable housing in higher opportunity areas? We can use things like incentives and low income housing tax credits. The third piece of this, though, and we always get this argument whenever we bring it up, especially by folks who are working in lower income, distressed areas. They say, look, you're talking about moving families out to these higher opportunity areas, and that's fine and good, but what are you going to do for these older neighborhoods? And a lot of those are the neighborhoods that we're talking about that then get turned over and gentrified. So one of the more interesting policy discussions for us, for instance, here in New York, is this policy of when you have affordable housing that is developed in a neighborhood, of allowing that 50% of it be available to the residents who live already in that area. And the fair housing analysis surrounding that.
Right.
That is one of the more interesting policy questions, and we have allowed that, but that is one that basically creates a lot of potential concern. But I see the rationale for it.
It's actually why I began
Because
with your remark about preserving community.
Yeah.
That's what's one of
But it is the subject of litigation.
Yeah.
It is the subject for some folks of concern about keeping lower income, especially minority folks, out of certain neighborhoods. And so there are arguments back and forth, but it is one way that folks have been able to preserve residents who have lived in an area, to keep them in that area.
Where they live, yeah. There are initiatives here in the city to next generation NYCHA for public housing. What do you make of that, and what can HUD do to further it if you think it's a good policy?
I'm impressed with the focus that the mayor has brought to affordable housing, and that Shola Latoye and the folks at NYCHA have brought. Obviously, NYCHA is a huge system, a lot of challenges, and that's an understatement. I know from maintenance all the way to the fact that they have a capital plan that right now they don't have the resources for, and you need to go find the money for it. We have pledged at HUD to work with them. What we like to see communities that are trying to take the initiative and make their own investments in affordable housing. And so it is important that Mayor de Blasio has stepped up and has made some of those investments, because that demonstrates a seriousness, and we want to work with communities like that.
I mean, the Bloomberg administration had tried late in its term to develop market rate housing on some of those sites, and that blew up. So the current administration is rethinking that policy in order to bring other kinds of developments onto NYCHA properties, to bring those campuses, knit them into the fabric of the neighborhoods, and also bring in services and other things which the campuses haven't had. In general, is that the kind of thing which you think is a good idea?
I believe that's something that we can support. Obviously, it depends on each individual development, and it also oftentimes depends on the outreach that a housing authority will do with residents to ensure that you have a smooth transition.
And that they benefit as well from
exactly, that you're not just displacing people, that you're going to have a significant benefit on the community that was there, or at least give them the option to be able to stay there.
Well, let me ask you in general about sprawl. I mean, what's your attitude towards, because we're here in New York City, we're talking now in the weeds of NYCHA housing, but at the country level, the national level, there's still an enormous amount of suburbanization and sprawl. How do you feel about that, and what can HUD do about it?
Well, what we're trying to do is that we want smart development policy in cities around the United States. So I used to be mayor of San Antonio. And just about every other week when we had our zoning hearings, developers would come and they make an argument that the policies that the city is passing are driving up development costs, and so they can't afford to build in the city. You know, I mean, I would usually dismiss that and like, okay, it's making it so you're taking more profit, right? Like, from this vantage point, I do think that there ought to be a balance and an analysis in a lot of communities on where they can be comfortable doing things to try and lower the cost of development in some communities, and also taking certain zoning or planning actions that encourage density, that look at things like parking requirements, how much space is required, so that you can make it more affordable for folks to develop in the urban core, or at least in the city limits of a community. But certain things you're not going to give up. For instance, for San Antonio, it was that's the biggest city that relies principally on an underground aquifer for our water. So we did not like folks developing over the recharge zone of the aquifer. some things you're not just going to give away. So there is a line, but how can we smartly lower the cost? That's one of the things that we're interested in. We also like to see...
You want to incentivize people to think in terms of density and building within cities, if possible.
Absolutely. I love it that America seems to be falling in love again with cities, and that this youngest generation likes the urban core lifestyle. I mean, we've seen it in city after city.
Fewer kids are buying cars. They don't want to own the cars. They'd rather drive bikes very often, yeah?
Sure, sure. And New York is tailor-made. It's a city that's tailor-made for something like that.
Yeah. So you mentioned the aquifer, so that leads me in a natural way to ask you about an initiative that had started under your predecessor, Sean Donovan, Rebuild by Design. It followed the Superstorm Sandy here. And HUD led the way in terms of a couple of big resilience initiatives. I want to ask you two things about that. What are you doing, if anything, to embed that initiative and that interest on HUD's part in the system? And then specifically, Rebuild came up with some really interesting proposals, and there was a lot of money behind it, and so far not a lot is happening as it's been turned over to local governments. So what can you do, and what are you doing to try to push those plans forward?
Yeah, so Rebuild by Design, and I give Sean all the credit. He came up with it along with Judith Roden at Rockefeller, who I think y'all are going to hear from later today. Was this idea that after Superstorm Sandy and the rebuilding effort here in the New York, New Jersey area, how do we not just rebuild, but rebuild in a way that is sustainable and both helps protect us against the next potential event and also is kind of usable rebuilding? So there are 6 projects that were done as part of Rebuild by Design that are innovative, that incorporate, as they rebuild, this sustainability into the infrastructure of it. A good example is here in Manhattan at East Park, and creating this bridge berm that will provide flood protection, but also, when it's not flooding, be usable as
We heard
green
a little
space.
bit about this last night from one of the architects involved, Bjork Engels. So
Excellent.
right.
So your question was, well, how do we embed that? How do we integrate that into what we're doing? The first step in that is something that's actually going on right now called the National Disaster Resilience Competition. There's $1 billion, and there's a competition among 67 communities, 48 states, and the rest are localities that had a disaster declaration between 2011 and 2013. And the competition is all about them with projects that incorporate sustainability into their infrastructure. What we believe is that these can be role models going forward for other communities as they use their CDBG dollars, their home dollars, their transportation dollars, and in that way, we integrate those principles into infrastructure development in the future.
I'm with you, but then, so another one of the initiatives is in Hoboken, and it's a fascinating proposal to really rethink Hoboken in different stages and to incorporate the people of Hoboken in deciding what priorities they have and setting those priorities. So far it seems like a slow process, and you have a very complicated political situation in New Jersey. So what can the federal government do to push that forward or to help the process move?
Well, there is a lot of technical assistance that HUD and the Rockefeller Foundation offered during this time. I mean, but let's get to it. Resources, that's the question. And the answer for that is, like a lot of things, we continue to be big advocates with Congress for the kinds of investment that we believe are necessary. But you're right. The trend of the last 35 years has been more and more to rely on state and local governments to make those investments. And so we'll do what we can with our traditional resources, and every year in our budget requests, we do request more dollars. However, I mean, there's no way to avoid the fact that when people think about Congress constraining resources, these are the kinds of things that are very meritorious that they're constraining.
Right. Well, let's hope that will change at some point soon.
I hope so.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for joining us. Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank y'all.